Welcome to the Book Club, the show that spotlights undiscovered authors and their books. Here's your host, John Austin.
Thanks, Lee, and welcome to today's edition of the Book Club. It's PhD Thursday. The intelligentsia has arrived. We have two really good authors and three very intriguing and important books today. Our guest for the first half hour is Dr. James Bailey, who's going to discuss two of his books. Jim Bailey is an engineering professor emeritus from Arizona State University. He was born in Detroit, Michigan. He retired early to pursue a second career as a historian and novelist, and he and his wife Petra split their time between Mesa and Pine Top, Arizona, which I finally was able to find Jim in Pine Top. Anyway, welcome to the Book Club, Jim.
Thank you. Appreciate being here.
We're going to begin with your novel, Bailey's Blood, Moonshine, Murder, and Wild Women. And I was telling Jim before we got in there, this is an unbelievable novel, but it is a factual account, as you will hear, and I don't think I've ever read a book like this. But anyway, before you give us a synopsis of the book, I'd like for you to read just that first paragraph of the preface, which I thought was outstanding.
I'd be glad to. My father wasn't the easiest person to get along with, and my grandfather was much worse. Both came from southeastern Kentucky, and both had demanding ideas about how families should be run and how men should act. Fortunately, neither of them were as mean as Grandpa's brother, William Bailey. Old Bill and his boys are said to have murdered as many as 10 to 20 people. Even today, Knox County refers to them as the Bad Baileys, and for good reason.
It certainly is good. I mean, there's a murder on every page in this book. But anyway, why don't you give us a synopsis of the book and tell us a little bit about what does go on? Because it spans, I think, from 1907 to 1936. 31, okay.
This was uncle and cousins, and I had heard about these people and their antics, but my grandmother didn't want anybody to tell all the details. And so when I retired, I began to do some research to find out more about them, and I uncovered 71 newspaper articles, court records, and oral histories. It's a family that lived in the backwoods of Knox County, and it wasn't until the 30s that community even had roads. And so they had no electricity and no roads, and they lived a very isolated clan type of life. But they were both proud and fearful, and I suggest that that's what happened to them and why they went bad. It's the same thing that happens to street gangs in our major cities, the same thing that happens with drug lords in Colombia and places like that. If you're very proud of who you are and very afraid of the next person, you have a tendency of shooting them. So they started off and by accident wound up killing two men from the neighboring family, the White family from a neighboring county, and that started a feud that lasted for quite a number of years. The book contains 10 different violent murders or deaths, and they just kept going back and forth. Sometimes they got out of the family and killed people other than the whites. William Bailey, the father, once killed his nephew because the nephew gave a bushel of apples to a black preacher. That kind of thing. Now, why would you shoot somebody over that? But that's what the book's all about. I don't want to tell you the ending, but the ending is kind of interesting too.
Yes, it is. I mean, that'll knock you off your feet. So there was one part at the beginning where boys were going someplace and they had guns, and one of the kids, I guess it was Jim, said, geez, let's just bring knives and have a knife fight instead of the guns. That way maybe all of us won't be killed. I thought, gee, okay, that's pretty tough cookies there.
Yes.
So what was it that that finally convinced you to write this book?
Well, as I did the research and found all these interesting stories, I thought that our family needed to know, and as well as other people in Knox County or southeastern Kentucky, they needed to know the truth about what happened, because they're still talked about. When I went to Knox County to do my research, several people, called me and said they wanted to talk with me. I had one person say, I think that person in your book is my mother, and another person say, that's my great-grandfather. So they needed to know, and I felt that somebody had to collect the data and then put it together. First book I wrote was The Baileys of Southeast Kentucky, and it has all the raw data, the newspaper articles and so forth. But then I wanted to put it together as a novel, so I could sort of give my opinion of why it happened and what really happened to all those folks in the end.
Well, the research must have been fun, obviously, but it must have been exhausting because you have so much in this book.
It was fairly exhausting. It took me a couple of years interviewing people and finding newspaper articles. You'd be surprised if you know the date that something happened. You can get on the web and look for newspapers in the community, in the neighborhood of where it happened, and you're liable to find a newspaper article. And I went to the Kentucky State Archives and looked for court records and things of this nature. There's an awful lot of stuff out there.
Well, you did a great job. I was going to mention it later on, but most of the chapters begin with a little historical information about the time, and then you relate a story that kind of relates back to what was happening in the country, or at that part of the country at the time.
Yeah, and I put my own backstory to it as to what the situation was.
This is really an important book. I think. It's just amazing to me all of these things that happened in this little place in Kentucky. So let's start with where the action began in 1907, and that was the party at Fred Moore's cabin.
Yes. There were three brothers. Bev was the oldest brother. John was a ne'er-do-well middle brother, and Jim was the youngest boy. He was bigger than his brothers and shy, but a very, very entrepreneurial, successful type person. His big brother, Bev, thought he was the big shot in the family, and they decided when Jim was 18 that they would take him to a party where he'd get his first invitation from a girl. And so they went to this party and finagled a way to get a Darcy Campbell to come to the party so that she would entice Jim to climb the stairs, if you will. And they got in. That John had to put his own spin on things, and so when Jim rejected Darcy's suggestion, John came over and told him that he's just a kid. He's unwilling to do this, and he called Darcy a whore. And Darcy's brother came over, and he was very upset about that, and so he picked a fight with John and wound up stabbing him, and the Baileys had to back out and go on home. And when they got home, their father was livid that they would back away from a fight. He thought it would be better to die in a knife fight than to back away. He was a very proud man, and he said, "You're Bailey boys, and nobody ever messes with a Bailey boy. The next time you see those people, I want you to drop them and carry iron with you wherever you go." So a few days later, they met them in Barberville, which is the Knox County seat, and they met them at a corral there, and there was a shootout, and they killed Lewis Campbell, the man who stabbed John, and they maimed his brother, maimed him for life. And they were tried for murder as a result of that. And Bev spent 3 years in prison. And you can imagine murdering a man and getting 3 years in prison, but that's what only price he paid. And that was the story that started them off on their murdering.
Right. Well, that's and you mentioned the town they lived in was Fount. Is that the way you pronounce it? Fount?
Fount, yes.
Yeah, okay. And you say there was just a horse trail to get in and out of, no electricity, no radio, no telephones. So the alpha males, I guess, turned to mayhem.
That's correct. That's correct. The only thing they had to do was fight for the alpha male title and drink and get drunk and see if they could find somebody to poke. Okay.
Okay. I'm always interested in the way people handle dialogue, and this you must have a terrific ear for dialogue. As we've had a couple of people who just really understand the dialogue. Did you hear that? I mean, where did you come up with that? Did you hear that someplace growing up? Or?
I like accent, and I did learn some of that dialogue as I was growing up. But when I was doing my research, I have relatives back there, and I would stay in their houses, and we would talk for a while, and you eventually pick up how those people talk. But I think dialogue, my idea of an author's role is to put people vicariously in situations, and they can sort of be a fly on the wall and watch what's happening. But in order to make that happen, I think you have to be authentic with vocabulary and dialogue and things of that nature.
Well, it certainly seems, it sounds or reads as authentic. I want to talk about Martha, the matriarch, because she's kind of a paradox. At first, she really is trying to get the boys to stay kids. They weren't kids, but the boys to stay out of trouble. On the other hand, she's saying, you're the Baileys and you don't take any guff from anybody.
Right. Yeah, she was actually insane. She was paranoid and a schizophrenic, and she thought every time she'd look out the window, she thought she saw somebody hiding behind a tree. And when the boys were like 12 or 13, she would gave them guns and had her husband teach them how to shoot, because in her warped mind, her only protection in life was that her sons would shoot anybody that was coming to attack her. In fact, she died in a sane asylum.
Yeah, I noticed that at the end of the book. Well, actually, now we're moving into there's the beginning of the feud is the poker game. I think that's where it all began, right?
That wasn't the feud. No, that was the beginning of the murders. The feud started on Valentine's Day, 1915.
Okay. Well, let's talk about the poker game, because I think that's very interesting, and then we'll talk about the whites who are they're very prominent and wealthy. The whites, as I understand the book, is
to this very day they own all the politics and all the legal system in Clay County.
Okay,
which is the neighboring county. Okay,
let's talk though for a minute about the poker game, which goes on for a while and ends up again with a killing.
That's correct.
So that poker game actually took place.
It actually took place, yes.
Right, and the fight was over basically a horse. I mean, right? I mean
that's correct. There were two Bailey boys there, Bev and Jim, and there were two white boys there, Percy and Letcher. And they had invited two guests because they thought you needed six to make a good poker game. One was Levi Lee, and another was John Briley, or Jim Briley. And Jim was not a good poker player. Jim Briley was not a good poker player, and he wound up losing all his money. And in the last hand, he sold his father's horse, for some money to continue to play, and he lost that. So on the way back home, on the ride back home, which was like 2:00 in the morning, he wanted to get his horse back, and Levi Lee wouldn't trade back or wouldn't buy it back. He said, "I'll come by tomorrow and we'll talk," because he wanted to embarrass Briley when he went home on an old mule. And when he wouldn't give the horse back to Briley pulled a gun, and then Bev, being the guy that tries to always get in the middle of things, stepped in between them and was knocked over the head and knocked off his horse. And so Jim pulled a gun and tried to kill Letcher, and his gun didn't fire. It jammed. So he jumped off his horse, grabbed Bev's gun, and was drunk as a dog, and grabbed the horse's head and hid behind the horse's neck, and just kept shooting, and wound up killing both of the white boys. And I read their death certificate, and their ma filled out the death certificate as the official, and she said, went out riding, got drunk, got shot, lived 30 minutes. That was the explanation of how they died, written by their own mother.
Oh.